What is it that calls us, as it were, commands us to think? What is it that calls us into thinking? The question asks what it is that commands us to enter into thought, that calls on us to think. It means, what is it that directs us into thought and gives us directions for thinking? The directions that come from what directs us into thought are much more than merely the given impetus to do some thinking. We first become capable of thinking, and thus are, as thinkers, only by virtue of its directive. What does call for thinking, in the sense of what calls on us to think, is foreign to the common understanding. What is called thinking presents itself at first quite innocently. It sounds as if, and we unknowingly take it as if, the question merely asked for more precise information about what is supposedly meant when we speak of such a thing as thinking. Thinking here appears as a theme with which one might deal as with any other. Yet, this fact, that man is naturally the performer of thinking, need not further concern the investigation of thinking. Indeed, it must be left out, for the laws of thought are, after all, valid independently of the man who performs the individual acts of thinking. We are asking for something that concerns ourselves because it calls upon us, upon our very being. We ourselves are, in the strict sense of the word, put in question by the question. The question, what does call for thinking, does more than merely struggle with an object in the manner of a scientific problem. If we are to hear the question in a sense which asks for what it is that directs us to think, we find ourselves suddenly compelled to accept the verb to call in a signification that is strange to us, or at least no longer familiar. We are now supposed to use the word to call in a signification which one might paraphrase approximately with the verbs invite, demand, instruct, direct. In the older Greek version of the New Testament, Matthew 8:18, we find, seeing a large crowd around him, he called to them to go to the other side. And that old word to call means to invite. In the question, what is called thinking? What does call for it? When we hear that question, the meaning of call, in the sense of instruct, demand, allow to reach, get on the way, convey, provide with a way, does not immediately occur to us. We do not have the habit, or only just barely, of using the word call in this sense, and so it remains unfamiliar to us. Instead, we follow the habitual signification of the verb to call, and, not giving it much thought, to call just simply means to give this or that name. To call, in short, means to command, provided we hear this word to in its native telling sense. For to command basically means not to give commands and orders, but to commend, entrust, give into safekeeping, keep safely. To call means to call into arrival and presence, to address commendingly. Accordingly, when we hear our question, what is called thinking, in the sense that it asks, what is it that appeals to us to think, we then are asking, what is it that enjoins our nature to think, and thus lets our nature reach thought, arrive in thinking, there to keep it safe? When we ask in this way, we do, of course, use the word to call in a rather unfamiliar signification, but it is unhabitual not because our spoken speech has never yet been at home in it, but rather because we are no longer at home with this telling word, because we no longer really live in it. It is as though man had to make an effort to live properly with language. It is as though such a dwelling were especially prone to succumb to the danger of commonness. Anything that departs from this commonness, in order to inhabit the formerly habitual proper speech of language, is at once considered a violation of the standard. It is branded as a frivolous whim. Is it playing with words when we attempt to give heed to this game of language and to hear what language really says when it speaks? If we succeed in hearing that, then it may happen, provided we proceed carefully, that we get more truly to the matter that is expressed in any telling and asking. Heidegger seems to be asking what distinguishes common sense thinking from called thinking, inspired thinking. So the title of his book, which he had a hand in translating into English, doesn't simply ask what do we mean by thinking, but it's asking what is called or inspired or beckoning thinking. What is it that directs us into thinking, that calls on us to think? I'm reading from Heidegger again. When we name a thing, after all, the name is not just draped over the thing. On the other hand, the name is an object. We see the relation between name and thing as the coordination of two objects. The coordination in turn is an object. Another aside of mine here, Gertrude Stein's theory of writing and language treated all words and their relations as objects. Okay, back to Heidegger. The only question is whether coordination will allow us to give heed to the peculiar property of the name. To name is to call something with a word. What is so called is then at the call of the word, as what is present, commanded, calling in to the calling word. This actually sounds like Gertrude Stein. So called by name, it in turn calls. By naming, we call on what is present to arrive, in a commending and a command. What makes a call upon us that we should think, and by thinking be who we are? The calling itself, on its own, needs thought, and thus commands, that is, brings our essential nature into thought, because what calls us wants itself to be thought about according to its nature. What calls on us to think demands for itself that it be tended, cared for, husbanded in its own essential nature by thought. And what gives us to think about? The gift it gives to us is nothing less than itself, thought. It first gives thought and thinking to us. It entrusts thought to us as our essential destiny. What is it that commands us to think? Must be asked first. That is something we cannot find out by ingenuity. It must reveal itself to us. And it will do so only if we let ourselves become involved in the questioning of the question. What is called thinking is still remote and seems almost strange to us. It becomes necessary then, first, to acquaint ourselves explicitly with the ambiguity of the question, in order that we may not take it as a mere matter of linguistic expression. The ambiguity lies in the verb to call. To call is not originally to name, but the other way around. Naming is a kind of calling. Every name is a kind of call. In that way, the welcome call of the invitation to come is nonetheless also an act of naming, a calling, which makes the newcomer what we call a guest whom we are glad to see. In reality, the calling stems from the place to which the call goes out. The mere cry dies away and collapses. The call, by contrast, is a reaching, even if it is neither heard nor answered. Calling offers an abode. The calling is not a call that has gone by, but one that has gone out, and as such is still calling and inviting. It calls even if it makes no sound. In its original root significance, we then hear the question, what is our own essential nature as such, which is insofar as it thinks? As we develop the question, it asks, how does it reach down into our very nature in order to demand from us that our nature be a thinking nature? In what way is our nature revealed to us? Only in this way, that we are called upon to think. As soon as we truly ask it, not just rattle it off, the calling wants to be thought about by its very nature and not just now and then, because in and by itself it gives food for thought, not just occasionally, but now and always. It is what we call most thought provoking. It first entrusts thought and thinking to us as what determines our nature. He seems to be saying the mystical premise that language is a living entity that consciously creates us so that it can have company. So that was lecture one of part two. Moving now into lecture two of part two. We are capable of thinking only insofar as we are endowed with what is most thought provoking, gifted with whatever and always wants to be thought about. Okay, my own paraphrase here of what he seems to be saying. Certain types of thought actually want you to think about them. If you do, they make you capable of real thinking. Okay, back to Heidegger. The involvement with thought is in itself a rare thing, reserved for few people. Precisely when we ask, what is it that calls on us to think? We reflect not only on the source of the calling, but with equal resolution on what it calls us to do. We are not only commanded and called upon to do something, but that something itself is named in the call. True, all of us should be greatly embarrassed if we had to say, straight out and unequivocally, what it is that the verb to think designates. But luckily, we do not have to say. We only are supposed to let ourselves become involved in the question. What is it to which the word thinking gives a name? We hear the words think, thought, thinking. As the saying goes, we attach a meaning to them. What comes to our minds here is at first fleeting and blurred. Most of the time, we can leave it at that. It satisfies the demands of common speech. In usual communication, such communication does not want to lose time tarrying over the sense of individual words. Instead, words are constantly thrown around on the cheap and in the process are worn out. There is a curious advantage in that. With a worn out language, everybody can talk about everything. Language is neither merely the field of expression, nor merely the means of expression, nor merely the two jointly. Thought and poetry are in themselves the originary, the essential, and therefore also the final speech. To speak language is totally different from employing language. Common speech merely employs language. This relation to language is just what constitutes its commonness. But because thought and, in a different way, poetry do not employ terms but speak words, therefore, we are compelled, as soon as we set out upon a way of thought, to give specific attention to what the word says. Terms are like buckets or kegs out of which we can scoop sense. When we are specially concerned with what the word tells us, we stay with our dictionaries. This is how things look at first. What we encounter at first is never what is near, but always only what is common. It possesses the unearthly power to break us of the habit of abiding in what is essential, often so definitively that we never come to abide anywhere. When we hear directly what is spoken directly, we do not at first hear the words as terms, still less the terms as mere sound. In order to hear the pure resonance of a mere sound, we must first remove ourselves from the sphere where speech meets with understanding or lack of understanding. We must disregard all that, abstract from it, if we are to subtract only the sound and resonance from what is spoken, if our ears are to catch the abstraction by itself, purely acoustically. Sound, which in the conceptual field of this supposed at first is regarded as immediately given, is an abstract construct that is at no time perceived alone by itself, nor ever at first when we hear something spoken. The supposedly purely sensual aspect of the word sound, conceived as mere resonance, is an abstraction. The mere vibration is always picked out only by an intermediate step, by that almost unnatural disregard. Even when we hear speech in a language totally unknown to us, we never hear mere sounds as a noise present only to our senses. We hear unintelligible words. But between the unintelligible word and the mere sound grasped in acoustic abstraction lies an abyss of difference in essence. Nor are mere terms given at first when we hear speech. As hearers, we abide in the sphere of what is spoken, where the voice of what is said rings without sound. From this sphere, whose essential nature we have barely caught sight of, much less thought about, the words disclose themselves which speak in what is spoken, and which simply do not stand out individually. Words are not terms, and thus are not like buckets and kegs from which we scoop a content that is there. Words are well springs that are found and dug up in the telling, well springs that must be found and dug up again and again, that easily cave in, but that at times also well up when least expected. If we do not go to the spring again and again, the buckets and kegs stay empty, or their content stays stale. A phrase of Blake comes to mind here: expect poison from the standing water. Okay, back to the text. To pay heed to what the words say is different in essence from what it first seems to be, a mere preoccupation with terms. Besides, to pay heed to what the words say is particularly difficult for us moderns because we find it hard to detach ourselves from the at first of what is common. And if we succeed for once, we relapse all too easily. But attention to what words tell us is supposedly the decisive step and directive on that way of thinking which is known by the name philosophy. And can philosophy be based on the explication of terms, that is, on historical insights? That would seem even less possible than the attempt to prove the proposition 2 times 2 equals 4 by an opinion poll which ascertains that, as far as can be observed, men do indeed always assert that 2 times 2 equals 4. Philosophy cannot be based on history, neither on the science of history nor on any other science. For every science rests on presuppositions which can never be established scientifically, though they can be demonstrated philosophically. All sciences are grounded in philosophy, but not vice versa. According to this reflection, philosophy is prevented from securing an alleged foundation for itself by way of an explanation of the meaning of words. Such explanations rely upon the history of language. They proceed historically. Knowledge of history, like all knowledge of matters of fact, is only conditionally certain, not unconditionally. All knowledge has this limitation that its statements are valid only so long as no new facts become known which compel the retraction of earlier statements. But philosophy is that supra-historical knowledge which, ever since Descartes, claims unconditional certainty for its tenets. The call to think determines what the word to think calls for, yet the call is not a constraining force. The call sets our nature free to think what is most thought-provoking. Freedom, therefore, is never something merely human, nor merely divine. Science does not think in the sense in which thinkers think. Still, it does not at all follow that thinking need pay no attention to the sciences. Yet, we have placed thinking close to poetry and at a distance from science. The essential closeness of poetry and thinking is so far from excluding their difference that, on the contrary, it establishes that difference. But precisely because thinking does not make poetry, but is a primal telling and speaking of language, it must stay close to poetry. And since science does not think, Thinking must, in its present situation, give to the sciences that searching attention which they are incapable of giving to themselves. Materiality does not stem from a separate and peculiar power bid on the part of the sciences, but from a fact in the nature of things that we moderns still do not want to see. Three propositions will serve to indicate it. One, modern science is grounded in the nature of technology. Two, the nature of technology is itself nothing technological. Three, the nature of technology is not a merely human fabrication which, given an appropriate moral constitution, could be subdued by superior human wisdom and judgment. Thinking itself is least familiar with the origin of its own essential nature. However, the question what is called thinking, or what is called thinking, is a world historical question. That which really is, in what way does it come to touch a man of our era? And historical and philosophical knowledge are radically different from each other. But can thinking ever be grounded on historical findings? This objection, which threatens our entire enterprise even in its first steps, how will we get it out of the way? We do not want at all to get this scruple out of the way. Let us meanwhile permit it to stand on the way on which it comes to meet us. For it could be that this way is no longer a way. Anyway, it might be considered advisable not to instigate a long-winded discussion of the relation between philosophy and science until we have gone through at least a few steps of the question, what is called thinking? And yet, that question may even be such that it will never allow us to go through, but instead requires that we settle down and live within it. So that was excerpts from Lecture 2 of Part 2. This is Lecture 3 excerpts. What is it that is named with the words think, thinking, thought? Toward what sphere of the spoken word do they direct us? A thought. Where is it? Where does it go? Thought is in need of memory, the gathering of thought. The Old English thinken, to think, and thankian, to thank, are closely related. But let us leave open all the relationships between those words, thinking, thought, thanks, and memory, and address our question now to the history of words. It gives us a direction. We take the clue that in the speaking of those words, the decisively and originally telling word is the thunk, but this word does not mean the current meaning still left over in our present usage of the word thought. A thought usually means an idea, a view or opinion, a notion. The root, originary word, says, the gathered, all gathering, thinking that recalls. Thinking, in the sense of that telling root word thonk, is almost closer to the origins than that thinking of the heart, which Pascal, centuries later and even then, in conscious opposition to mathematical thinking, attempted to retrieve. Compared with the root thonk, thought in the sense of logical, rational representations turns out to be a reduction and an impoverishment of the word that beggar the imagination. Academic philosophy has done its share to stunt the word, from which we may gather that conceptual definitions of terms, while necessary for technical and scientific purposes, are by themselves unfit to assure, much less advance, the soundness of language, as they are generally assumed to do. But the word the thonk does not mean only what we call a man's disposition or heart, and whose essential nature we can hardly fathom. Both memory and thanks move and have their being in the thunk. Memory initially did not at all mean the power to recall. The word designates the whole disposition in the sense of a steadfast, intimate concentration upon the things that essentially speak to us in every thoughtful meditation. Originally, memory means as much as devotion, a constant, concentrated abiding with something, not just with something that has passed, but in the same way with what is present and with what may come. What is past, present, and to come appears in the oneness of its own present being. Inasmuch as memory, the concentration of our disposition, devotion, does not let go of that on which it concentrates, memory is imbued not just with the quality of essential recall, but equally with the quality of an unrelinquishing and unrelenting retention. Out of the memory, and within the memory, the soul then pours forth its wealth of images, of visions envisioning the soul itself. The thought, being the memory so understood, is by the same token also what the word thanks designates. But thanking, enacted by itself, as payment and repayment, remains too easily bogged down in the sphere of mere conventional recompense, even mere business. When we give thanks, we give it for something. We give thanks for something by giving thanks to Him whom we have to thank for it. The things for which we owe thanks are not things we have from ourselves. They are given to us. We receive many gifts, of many kinds. But the highest and really most lasting gift given to us is always our essential nature, with which we are gifted in such a way that we are what we are only through it. That is why we owe thanks for this endowment, first and unceasingly. But the thing given to us, in the sense of this dowry, is thinking. As thinking, it is pledged to what is there to be thought. And the thing that of itself ever and anon gives food for thought is what is the most thought provoking. In it resides the real endowment of our nature for which we owe thanks. How can we give thanks for this endowment, the gift of being able to think what is most thought provoking, more fittingly than by giving thought to the most thought provoking? The supreme thanks, then, would be thinking, and the profoundest thanklessness, thoughtlessness. Real thanks, then, never consists in that we ourselves come bearing gifts merely to repay gift with gift. Pure thanks is rather that we simply think. Think what is really and solely given, what is there to be thought. All thanksgiving belongs first and last in the essential realm of thinking, but thinking devotes its thought to what is to be thought, to that which in itself of its own accord wants to be thought about, and thus innately demands that we think back to it. When we think what is most thought provoking, we think properly. When we, in thinking, are gathered and concentrated on the most thought provoking, then we dwell where all recalling thought is gathered. The gathering of thinking back into what must be thought is what we call the memory. We do not understand this word any longer in its common meaning. Instead, we are following the directive of the ancient word, and we take it by no means only in the sense of written history. We are heeding what is called by name in it, and what is unspoken in it at the same time, are keeping in view all that has meanwhile been said about thinking as thanks, and as memory and thinking back. When we listen to the word thonk in its basic meaning, we hear at once the essence of the two words, thinking and memory, thinking and thanks, which readily suggest themselves in the verb to think. It is only that we fail too easily to hear what is spoken. Whenever we speak of subject and object, there is in our thoughts a project and a base, an oppositeness. There is always contact in the widest sense. It is possible that the thing which touches us and is in touch with us, if we achieve our humanity, need not be represented by us constantly and specifically. But even so, it is concentrated, gathered toward us beforehand. In a certain manner, though not exclusively, we ourselves are that gathering. The gathering of what is next to us here never means an after-the-fact collection of what basically exists, but the tidings that overtake all our doings, the tidings of what we are committed to beforehand by being human beings. Only because we are by nature gathered in contiguity can we remain concentrated on what is at once present and past and to come. The word memory originally means this incessant concentration on contiguity. In its original telling sense, memory means as much as devotion. This word possesses the special tone of the pious and piety and designates the devotion of prayer only because it denotes the all-comprehensive relation of concentration upon the holy and gracious. The thonk unfolds in memory, which persists as devotion. Memory, in this originary sense, later loses its name to a restricted denomination, which now signifies no more than the capacity to retain things that are in the past. But if we understand memory in the light of the old word thonk, the connection between memory and thanks will dawn on us at once. For in giving thanks, the heart in thought recalls where it remains gathered and concentrated because that is where it belongs. This thinking that recalls in memory is the original thanks. The originary word thonk allows us to hear what the word thinking tells us. This manner of hearing corresponds to the essential situation which the word thonk designates. This manner of hearing is the decisive one. Through it, we understand what calls for thinking by way of the thonk. The current familiar usage, by contrast, leads us to believe that thinking does not stem from thought, but that thoughts first arise out of thinking. However, we must listen still more closely to the sphere that appeals to us in the originary words, thonk, memory, thanks. What gives us food for thought ever and again is the most thought-provoking. We take the gift it gives by giving thought to what is most thought-provoking. In doing so, we keep thinking what is most thought-provoking. We recall it in thought. Thus, we recall in thought that to which we owe thanks for the endowment of our nature, thinking. As we give thought to what is most thought-provoking, we give thanks. I'd like you to get a hold of the complete copy of Gertrude Stein's The Making of Americans and read that last passage, which I'm tempted to read to you now, but I'll resist the temptation. Every family living can be one being existing, and every family existing can be remembering something of some such thing. She does about, at least 100 different variations on that. It sounds like, he's sounding like that here. To the most thought-provoking, we devote our thinking to what is to be thought. But this devoted thought is not something that we ourselves produce and bring along to repay gift with gift. When we think what is most thought-provoking, we then give thought to what this most thought-provoking matter itself gives us to think about. I wonder if you read Gertrude Stein. This thinking which recalls, and which qua thinking alone is true thanks, does not need to repay. By the way, you can get that The Making of Americans. I got it for a penny plus postage. Nobody wants it. So there's lots of copies floating around that you can get. I don't think you can get the complete version in PDF online or anything. Anyway, this thinking which recalls, and which qua thinking alone is true thanks, does not need to repay, nor be deserved, in order to give thanks. Such thanks is not a recompense, but it remains an offering, and only by this offering do we allow that which properly gives food for thought to remain what it is in its essential nature. Thus, we give thanks for our thinking, in a sense that is almost lost to our language, and so far as I can see, is retained only in our Alemannic usage. Alemannic being a group of dialects of the Upper German branch of the Germanic language family. When the transaction of a matter is settled or disposed of, we say in Alemannic dialect that it is thanked. Disposing does not mean here sending off, but the reverse. It means to bring the matter forth and leave it where it belongs. This sort of disposing is called thanking. If thinking could dispose of that which ever and again gives food for thought into its own nature, such thinking would be the highest thanks mortals can give. Such thinking would be the thankful disposal of what is most thought-provoking into its most integral seclusion, a seclusion where the most thought-provoking is invulnerably preserved in its problematic being. Not one of us here would presume to claim that he is even remotely capable of such thinking, or even a prelude to it. At the very most, we shall succeed in preparing for it. But assuming that some men will be capable of it some day, of thinking in the mode of such thankful disposal, then this thinking would at once be concentrated in the recall which recalls what is forever most thought-provoking. Then thinking would dwell within memory, memory understood in the sense of its originary expression.